My name is Joanna Marsh, and I am 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the estate reading where we discovered my grandmother had sold her house 6 months before she died, and about the phone call we made to the buyer, and about what Samuel O'Coffer told us in that phone call about my grandmother and a 7th-grade English class in 1974 that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about who she was. My grandmother, Eleanor, had lived on Weller Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, for 41 years. She had moved into the house with my grandfather in 1979, raised 2 children there, stayed after my grandfather died in 2003, continued staying in the specific, decisive way of a woman who had decided that the house was home, and that home did not require a reason to maintain beyond the fact that it was home. She died in November. She was 80 years old and had been in declining health for the previous 2 years, in the managed, gradual way that declining health sometimes works in older people, a slow reduction of capacity rather than a sudden event, the kind of dying that allows for some preparation even when it does not allow for enough. We were her family. Her son, Richard, who was 62, and who had been the practical manager of her affairs for the previous 4 years, the bill paying and the medical appointments, and the occasional contractor for house maintenance. Her daughter, Patricia, my mother, who was 58, and who had grown up in that house and visited every few weeks throughout my grandmother's final years. Me and my 2 cousins, the grandchildren, all adults, all of us understanding the house on Weller Street as the fixed center of the family, the place where Christmas happened and where Thanksgiving happened, and where we had all learned to walk in the same living room. Richard had been assuming he would inherit the house. He had not stated this assumption directly, at least not in any conversation I had been present for, but it was the assumption that had organized his management of my grandmother's affairs, and it was visible in the way he discussed the house when Eleanor's situation had come up in family conversations. The estate attorney was a woman named Helen Torres, not the same attorney Richard had expected, which we learned at the reading itself. Eleanor had retained Helen separately, which was the first signal that the reading was going to contain something different from what we expected. Helen opened the reading with the standard inventory of the estate: financial accounts, personal property, a small investment account. Then she said, "The property at Weller Street is not included in the estate." She said it the way attorneys say things that are going to require explanation, clearly and without softening, giving the information rather than the reaction to it. Richard said, "What do you mean it is not included?" Helen said, "The property was sold 6 months ago." She said, "Your mother completed the sale in May through a private transaction." She said, "The proceeds from the sale were distributed per your mother's instructions at the time of the sale and are not part of the estate." The room was the specific silence of 4 people receiving information that requires complete revision of multiple things simultaneously. Richard asked who had bought it. Helen said she had the buyer's name and contact information in the document, and that my grandmother had anticipated the family might want to be in touch and had noted that the buyer was expecting to hear from them. She gave us the name, Samuel O'Coffer. She gave us a phone number. Richard called the number from the parking lot of Helen's office building, all 4 of us standing around him in the specific, tight formation of a family that has just received confusing news and is waiting together for the next piece of information that will make it make sense. Samuel answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was warm and careful, the voice of someone who has been prepared for a difficult conversation and has organized himself for it. Richard said he was Eleanor Marsh's son, and that they had just come from the estate reading and understood Samuel had purchased her house and wanted to understand more. Samuel said, "I have been thinking about what to say to you since I heard she was gone." He said, "I was hoping you would call." He said, "I want to tell you about your mother, if you will let me." Richard looked at my mother. My mother looked at me. We all looked at each other for a moment. Then Richard said, "Yes." He said, "Please." Samuel said, I was in your mother's 7th grade English class in 1974 at Harriet Beecher Stowe Middle School. He said, I was 12 years old, and I was not a good student, not because I was not capable, but because I was not in circumstances that made being a good student easy. He said, my family was going through a significant crisis that year, the details of which are mine to keep, which made the classroom a difficult place to be present in. He said, your mother noticed, not in the way that teachers sometimes notice, which is the noticing that produces paperwork and interventions, and the specific, well-intentioned machinery of institutions trying to address problems. She noticed in the way a person notices, which means she sat next to me after class one afternoon and asked what was going on. He said, I told her more than I had told anyone. He said, I do not know why. He said, there was something about the way she asked that made lying feel like the wrong response. He said, she did not fix what was happening at home. She could not. But she did something else. She gave me books, specific books she had chosen for me specifically, not the class reading list, but books she thought I needed, and she asked me what I thought of them, and she listened to what I said with the specific attention of someone who believed that what a 12-year-old thought about a book was worth hearing. He said, your mother saved my life. He said it simply. He said, I do not mean that dramatically. I mean that the year I spent in her classroom was the year I understood that someone believed I was worth investing in, and that belief was what I carried out of that school and into everything I built after it.
Samuel talked for 40 minutes on that phone call. We stood in the parking lot of Helen's office building, and we let him talk because what he was saying was the kind of thing you do not interrupt. He described the 50 years between 1974 and the day Eleanor had called him. He had become a civil rights attorney. He had spent 30 years in public interest law, working for organizations that served communities that did not have access to the kind of legal representation that Samuel had understood from personal experience was the difference between outcomes. He had built a career that was, by his own assessment, directly traceable to the year he had spent in a 7th grade classroom with a teacher who had given him books and asked what he thought of them. He had tried to find Eleanor's several times across the decades, social media searches that had not been productive, a letter sent to her school that had been returned because she had retired, a search through alumni networks that had not connected. He had not been able to find her and had eventually accepted that he might not. Then Eleanor had found him. She had been going through her own things in the way that people in their late 70s go through their things, not with the urgency of illness, but with the deliberate attention of someone who is organizing a life rather than simply living it. She had found her old class rosters. She had found his name. She had found him. She had called him on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He said he had not recognized the number and had almost let it go to voicemail. He said, something made me answer. He said, her voice was exactly the same. They had talked for an hour on that first call, several more times in the weeks following. He had visited her in Cincinnati in April. He had sat in the living room of the house on Weller Street, and she had made coffee, and they had talked for 3 hours about the 50 years between the classroom and the living room. He said, she told me she had been thinking about what to do with the house. He said she did not want it to be sold to a developer. She said the neighborhood had been her neighborhood for 41 years, and she wanted it to stay a home rather than become something else. He said, she asked if I wanted to buy it. He said, I did not understand what she was asking at first. He said, she said, Samuel, you gave me the best part of my career. You were the student who reminded me why teaching mattered. I want you to have the house. Richard had not said anything for several minutes. My mother was crying in the quiet way she cried when something hit the specific register of the true and the overwhelming simultaneously. I was holding my phone in my hand, and I was not crying yet, but I was close. Samuel said, I bought it at fair market value. He said, I want to be clear about that because I do not want the family to think she undervalued what she had built.
He said, I paid what the house was worth. He said she used the proceeds for things she wanted to do in her final months, donations she had been planning, and specific practical arrangements she had wanted to make. He said, she told me she had written a letter for the family. He said, did you receive it? We had not received a letter. Helen, when Richard called her back, confirmed that there was a letter in the estate documents that had been marked to be distributed after the reading. She had not mentioned it because she had been waiting for us to absorb the primary information first. We drove back to Helen's office. She gave us the letter. It was 2 pages in Eleanor's handwriting, which had been distinctive across our entire lives, the specific neat cursive of a woman who had taught language for 30 years and who understood that handwriting was its own form of communication. She wrote about Samuel first. She described the class of 1974 and the Tuesday afternoon when she had noticed a 12-year-old who was not able to be present in the classroom in the way that 12-year-olds need to be present, and asked him what was going on. She described the books she had given him and the conversations they had had, and the specific moment near the end of the year when she had understood that something had shifted, that he was arriving in the classroom differently, with something that had not been there in September. She wrote, Samuel O'Coffer became a civil rights attorney. He spent 30 years protecting people who needed protecting. I did not know this until he found me this spring, but when he told me, I understood something I had been hoping for 40 years without knowing I was hoping for it. She wrote, I had a good career. I taught for 31 years, and I believe I was a good teacher for most of them. But Samuel was the student I had wondered about, the one who had been at a turning point when I met him, and who I had hoped across 50 years had turned towards something that served him. She wrote, the house belongs to him now. I am glad. My mother read the letter after Richard. She folded it carefully when she finished, and she held it in both hands for a long time without saying anything. We met Samuel in person 2 weeks after the phone call. He had offered to let us come to the house on Weller Street, understanding that the family would need to see it one more time in some form, and wanting to make that possible rather than something we had to ask for. He met us at the front door. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with the specific composed presence of a person who has spent 30 years in rooms where things are difficult and has learned how to be fully there for all of it. He shook Richard's hand. He embraced my mother, which surprised me until I saw her face, which was the face of someone receiving something she had not known she needed. He showed us through the house. He had made minimal changes, which I believe he understood we needed to see. The living room was the same living room. The kitchen was the same kitchen. My grandmother's garden through the back window was tended in the same way she had tended it, which I learned later was because Samuel had asked her specific questions about how she maintained it during his April visit, and had been following her instructions since. He brought us to the room that had been her study, where she had kept her books and her papers and the specific organized materials of a retired teacher who had never fully stopped being a teacher. The shelves were still full. He had not moved her books. He said he had not been sure what to do with them and had been waiting to hear from the family. Richard said, "Keep them." He said it quickly and then looked slightly surprised at himself for having said it that quickly. He said, "She would want them in this house." Samuel said, "I think so too." He said, "I plan to read all of them." We sat in the kitchen for an hour. Samuel told us more about the 50 years, the cases he had taken, the organization he had built, the specific moments across 3 decades of legal work where he had traced his own capacity back to a Tuesday afternoon in 7th grade when a teacher had asked him what was going on and had actually waited for the answer. Richard asked him what it felt like to be back in the house. Samuel said, "It feels like completing something." He said, "Your mother called it coming home." He said, "She told me the house had been waiting for the right person." He said he had not known what she meant at the time. He said, "I think I understand it now." We left Weller Street in the late afternoon. The drive home was quiet in the way that drives home are quiet when something significant has happened, and everyone is still inside it. My mother said once that she had not understood her mother as well as she had believed she did. She said it without sadness, with the specific, honest quality of someone arriving at an accurate assessment. She said, "I knew she was a good teacher. I did not know she was that kind of teacher." I said, "I think she was always that kind of teacher. I think Samuel was the one who remembered it clearly enough to come back and tell us." My mother nodded. She said, "I am glad she sold him the house." She said it simply and completely, without any of the complication that the statement might have carried at the estate reading. She said, "I am glad she did it the way she did." Eleanor Marsh taught English for 31 years. She retired in 1997. She lived on Weller Street for 41 years. She sold her house 6 months before she died to a man she had taught in 7th grade and who had spent 50 years becoming exactly the person she had understood he was going to become when he was 12 years old and sitting in her classroom, not quite present and not quite gone. She knew what she was doing. She always had. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.